The first thing I noticed was the cold, not the kind that prickles your skin in winter, but a sterile, artificial cold, the kind that seeps into your bones and makes everything inside you feel suspended. My eyes opened slowly, lashes sticking together with sleep or something heavier, and the ceiling above me was unfamiliar. Pale, square-tiled, humming with faint electricity. I tried to move, but my limbs responded like they belonged to someone else. My fingers were curled inward, my mouth dry, throat scratchy like I'd swallowed dust. For a moment, I wasn't sure if I was alive or dreaming. The light in the room was dim, tinged blue, as if the day outside had forgotten to rise. My vision blurred, then cleared, and I saw the IV tube snaking from my arm like an accusation. The soft beep of monitors anchored me to a reality I hadn't agreed to. My skin felt foreign. My breath didn't sound like mine. I stared at the slow drip from the IV bag, hypnotized by the rhythm, wondering how I had gotten here. My memory refused to fill in the blanks, just flashes, fluorescent lights, a hard floor, the rustle of plastic, voices that didn't belong to anyone I knew. The bed beneath me felt too big, too white, too clean. I was wrapped in a gown that opened in the back, exposing me in a way that felt deliberate, not clinical. My legs were stiff, bent slightly, the sheet clinging to my knees. Everything about my body felt exaggerated, my heartbeat too loud, my breath too shallow, my skin too sensitive. I shifted slightly, and pain bloomed in my side, sharp and sudden, like my own body was angry with me. I didn't recognize this pain. I didn't recognize this body. I felt like a visitor in my own form. A nurse entered briefly at some point. I couldn't place when, and adjusted something beside me. I only remember the sensation of her cool hands and the sudden awareness of how exposed I was. There was no dignity in sickness, no power, just fabric and plastic and the soft scrape of latex against skin. When she left, the silence returned like a weight, and I stared at the ceiling again, counting tiles, pretending that would make the world feel less tilted. But no amount of math could distract me from the truth I was starting to accept. I didn't belong to myself anymore. I wondered how long I had been like this, how many nights had passed while I drifted in and out of consciousness. I looked at my hands and didn't recognize them. The skin looked looser, drier, the veins more prominent. My nails had grown longer than I remembered. My fingers trembled slightly when I tried to lift them from the blanket. I wasn't in control anymore. Something had happened. Something had taken ownership of this body, and I was now just a tenant, watching from behind the eyes. I tried to remember what led me here, but everything was fragmented. I recalled standing in line at the grocery store, the weight of a bag in my hand, a rush of heat, then blackness. The next memory was this room, this bed, this shell of a body that didn't feel like it belonged to me. My mind remained sharp in its confusion, circling itself like a caged animal, trying to understand how my life had narrowed to this moment, to this sterile room, to this stuttering heart in my chest. I closed my eyes, hoping that sleep would restore something, anything. But the darkness only made it worse. In the dark, the room stretched around me like a void. I felt the shape of my body against the mattress, and it felt wrong. My hips too wide, my shoulders too narrow. The weight of the blanket was both too much and not enough. My own breathing irritated me. I couldn't find a rhythm that felt natural. I couldn't remember what it felt like to move without effort. The hours passed in a blur of stillness. I watched the light shift slightly on the walls, but no one came. No voices filtered through the hallway. It was as if I had been placed here and forgotten. The loneliness of that realization pressed into my chest more painfully than the IV needle in my arm. I had no phone, no clock, no mirror. I couldn't even remember what I looked like. The absence of reflection made it worse. It wasn't just that I didn't feel like myself. It was that I couldn't even prove I still existed in the same shape I used to. Somewhere in the silence, I began to detach. I stopped trying to feel comfortable. I stopped trying to remember. I allowed myself to become something small, something still. I stopped thinking of my body as mine and began thinking of it as a vessel, a temporary arrangement. I studied the pattern of the ceiling tiles like constellations. I imagined myself floating above the room, watching from the corners. It was easier that way, less painful. If I couldn't escape the bed, I could at least escape the idea that I was still whole. And then, in the slow drift of another hour, I began to feel something else. Not healing, not hope, just attention. My senses sharpened slightly. I began to notice sounds again, the subtle hum of machines, the whisper of fabric when I shifted, the creak of footsteps in the hall. I felt my body begin to respond, not with strength, but with presence. The pain didn't vanish, but it no longer consumed. It became a perimeter, a shape, a boundary. My skin still felt strange, my breath still unfamiliar, but there was awareness there. Awareness that I was still here, even if barely. That realization didn't bring comfort. It brought vulnerability. It made me aware of how easily I could be touched, changed, rearranged without protest. This wasn't strength. This was surrender. Not the noble kind, but the quiet, invisible surrender that happens when you no longer have the will to resist. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I just laid there, watching the light on the ceiling, listening to the whisper of my pulse, waiting for something, someone to remind me what it meant to be human again. The nights in the hospital became their own kind of landscape, stretched, quiet, not fully dark, but never truly light. Time didn't move the same way after the sun went down. The shadows softened every surface, every corner became rounded, and the edges of things lost their meaning. I would lie still beneath the thin blanket, my body half aware, suspended between the remnants of pain and the anticipation of something I didn't yet understand. I could feel the silence settle over me like fabric, delicate and heavy all at once. At first, I didn't notice her arrival. The nurses came and went in routine patterns, each one indistinguishable from the last, professional, brisk, mechanical. But then came a night when the rhythm changed. It was subtle, the shift of air, the absence of hurried footsteps, a calmness. She moved differently, with the kind of presence that made you aware of your own skin. I didn't know her name yet, but her energy was impossible to ignore. She didn't just enter the room, she inhabited it. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her movements were unhurried, deliberate, as if each action held some deeper intention. The sound of her gloves snapping into place should have felt clinical, but instead it echoed like a ritual. She adjusted my IV, checked the monitor, and placed her hand on my wrist with care that bordered on tenderness. Her fingers lingered just a moment longer than they should have, warm and grounding, as if reminding me that I was still here, still human. That first touch stayed with me long after she left. It haunted me, not in a frightening way, but with a kind of warmth I couldn't explain. I replayed it in my mind like a note of music stuck in a loop, over and over, until I wasn't sure if I had imagined it. But the next night, she returned. Same time, same quiet presence. This time, her touch came sooner. her palm brushing my forearm as she adjusted the blanket, the edge of her thumb grazing the inside of my elbow. I felt it in places far from where she touched. It spread like heat beneath my skin. After that, I began to wait for her. I would pretend to sleep, lying motionless with my breath slow and shallow, but inside I was taut with attention. I knew the moment she walked in. My pulse would quicken. My chest would rise higher with each breath, though I tried to control it. Her hands would always find me, not intrusively, not in violation, but with purpose. She would smooth my sheet, gently lift my arm to check the IV, reposition my legs without explanation, and each time the contact would last a fraction longer than necessary. There was no question in her touch, but there was something else, awareness, as if we were both pretending to play our roles, but had silently agreed to something deeper. The gloved fingers no longer felt like barriers. Even through the latex, I could feel her intent. She wasn't just taking care of me. She was studying me, learning me, communing with something I hadn't realized was still alive inside my body. Desire, maybe? Or the craving to be seen. Some nights she didn't touch me at all, but her absence was more intimate than anyone else's attention. She would stand near the foot of the bed, her silhouette outlined by the soft light from the hallway, and I could feel her watching me, not with judgment, not even with concern, just presence, a shared stillness. The silence between us wasn't empty anymore. It was charged, heavy with a kind of longing I didn't have the language to name. I began to measure time by her visits. Each one a breath in a life that had otherwise gone breathless. The sterile room felt less hostile when she was in it. The machines, the wires, the smell of antiseptic, all of it faded when her fingers met my skin. She never hurried, even when her tasks were routine. I began to wonder if she came only to me, if she lingered in other rooms the same way. The thought twisted something inside me. Not jealousy, not exactly, but a hunger to be singular in her attention. My senses grew sharper at night. I started to anticipate the moment her hand would rest on my shoulder or tuck the blanket under my chin. I would lean ever so slightly into the contact, pretending it was involuntary. When she touched my forehead to check for fever, my eyes would flutter open just briefly. Sometimes our gazes met, only for a second, but in that second, I felt stripped bare, not exposed, but understood. There were times when she sat beside me, never for long, just a moment perched on the edge of the bed or on the nearby chair, her hands resting in her lap, her body calm and steady. I never moved. I didn't want to break whatever spell we existed under. Her proximity did something strange to my breath, slowing it, deepening it, while my heart thudded louder against my ribs. I could feel the warmth of her thigh near my arm, the whisper of her scent, skin, and something floral, subtle, and impossible to forget. One night, she rested her hand on top of mine. No medical reason, no excuse. Her fingers curled around mine, and I let them. The contact was gentle, unmoving. I stared at the ceiling, but my entire awareness tunneled down into that one point of connection. It wasn't erotic, not yet, but it was intimate in a way that left my body humming for hours afterward. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't want to. I wanted to stay in the echo of that touch as long as I could. The line between care and something else began to blur. She would trace her fingers lightly across the inside of my arm, checking for bruising. Her knuckles would brush the side of my breast when adjusting the monitors. Her breath would warm my cheek as she leaned over me. I told myself it was nothing, that I was projecting, that I was vulnerable, touch-starved, confused. But none of that explained the precision of her touch, the slowness, the attention, the unmistakable pulse between us. I began to crave the night, Not for rest, but for her. I would watch the sun go down through the tiny window, feel the anticipation rise as the hallway quieted. My body would prepare itself, skin tightening with expectation. I would rehearse stillness, eyes closed, muscles soft. But everything inside me was awake, alert, reaching. She always came, and with her came the promise of being felt, remembered, seen. It never went further than those touches. Not yet. But something between us had already shifted. We were no longer just nurse and patient. We were something undefined, suspended in a fragile quiet where each movement meant more than it should. I didn't know where it would lead. I only knew I didn't want it to stop, because in her hands, I no longer felt like a patient. I felt like a body worth touching, a woman worth watching, a soul pulled gently back into the light, one nightly contact at a time. There was no plan, no signal, no announcement. Just a night like the others, dimly lit, quiet, weighed down by that strange hospital silence that never felt peaceful, only suspended. I was already awake when she entered, pretending to sleep, heart steady on the surface but pacing beneath my ribs. I could feel the heat of her presence as she approached, the subtle pressure in the air, like something was about to unfold, and neither of us could stop it. The room didn't feel clinical anymore. It felt intimate, like a held breath stretched too long, waiting to be exhaled. She stood at the edge of the bed for a moment, longer than usual, her hands at her sides, as if unsure whether to move closer or walk away. I could hear her breathing. I could feel the tension ripple through the space between us, delicate and volatile. When she finally placed her hand on my wrist, it wasn't the gentle, professional touch I had grown used to. It was slower, more deliberate. Her fingers pressed lightly, not to check my pulse, but as if memorizing the shape of me. My breath caught, and though my eyes were closed, I knew she was watching. The sheet was thin and pulled high on my chest. She adjusted it with one hand, fingers brushing my collarbone. My skin responded instantly. I felt goosebumps rise, not from cold, but from the unmistakable awareness of being touched with intent. Her hand lingered for a heartbeat longer than necessary, and then she pulled away, but not completely. Her fingertips hovered over the edge of the fabric, almost trembling, almost asking. I didn't move. I didn't open my eyes, but every muscle in my body said yes. The silence between us deepened. There were no words, but something passed from her body into mine through that charged space. I felt her sit on the edge of the bed, her thigh barely touching my hip. Her weight dipped the mattress just enough for my body to shift toward her. Her presence was overwhelming, warmth, scent, quiet restraint. When her hand returned, it was on my shoulder, then my upper chest. My breathing turned shallow, my body humming in response to every millimeter of contact. Then she touched my face. Her fingertips traced along my jaw, down to the hollow of my throat. It was a gesture so intimate, so careful, it felt like prayer. My lips parted involuntarily, not to speak, but to release the breath I'd been holding. Her fingers followed the line of my collarbone, slipping beneath the edge of the gown. I didn't stop her. I couldn't. The fabric fell away slowly, pulled down with reverence rather than urgency. My chest rose fully into the open air, exposed to her gaze, and still I kept my eyes closed. I didn't need to see her to know how she looked at me. I could feel it in every cell. Her mouth was next, warm, deliberate, pressing against my skin in a slow descent. She kissed just above my breast, then the side, then finally the center. I trembled. Her lips were soft, but her intention was unmistakable. She kissed like she wanted to be remembered, like she needed to mark this moment onto me in ways that wouldn't fade. My hands remained at my sides, stiff with restraint, but my fingers curled into the sheet, aching to hold her, to pull her closer. Her kisses traveled lower, past the edge of the gown now bunched at my waist. She adjusted the blanket with slow precision, uncovering my abdomen, then my hips. I felt her breath first, hot and shallow, then her palm on my thigh. My legs parted slightly, involuntarily, making room for something unspoken, something inevitable. She didn't rush. She didn't fumble. Her hand slid gently between my legs, over the thin hospital-issued panties, pressing just enough for me to feel the tremor begin. My body arched into her hand before I even realized I had moved. She took her time. She pulled the panties down slowly, exposing me inch by inch, and every movement felt ceremonial. Her fingers found me first, light and exploring, tracing every soft line. I was already wet, already open. My body had decided for me long ago. When her mouth replaced her hand, I forgot where I was, forgot what I was. I only knew the rhythm of her tongue, the pressure of her mouth, the quiet noises I could no longer suppress. I bit my lip, my hands now gripping the edges of the bed, holding on for something I didn't have a name for. She tasted me like she was learning me. Every flick of her tongue was measured, precise, and unrelenting. She pressed her hands beneath my thighs to keep me still, but I writhed anyway, my hips lifting, chasing her, needing more. My climax came in a wave, sudden and shattering. I didn't cry out, but the sound I made echoed inside me long after she pulled away. My body pulsed against the mattress, muscles tense then soft, breath shallow and desperate. She didn't move immediately. She stayed there, her head resting against my hip, her breath slow and steady, grounding me. When she finally rose, she pulled the blanket back over me gently. Her hand smoothed the sheet over my body, covering what had just been exposed, but nothing about me felt hidden anymore. I opened my eyes just in time to see her looking at me, her gaze steady, quiet, unreadable. She didn't smile, she didn't speak. She just stood, adjusted her clothes, and walked to the door. The click as it closed behind her was softer than a whisper, but it stayed with me like thunder. I lay in the same position for what felt like hours, unable to move, unwilling to disturb the silence she left behind. My body still tingled from her touch, the memory of her mouth, the weight of her hands. Nothing in the room looked different, and yet everything had changed. The air smelled the same, the light hadn't shifted, but I no longer felt like a patient. I felt like a secret, a confession, a turning point carved in skin and silence. Something had been given, something had been taken, and I knew, deep in the ache between my thighs, that the boundary between care and craving had been completely, irrevocably erased. The next day unfolded like the others, with its sterile sameness and rhythmic intrusions of routine care, but something in me had shifted. My body still bore the echo of her mouth, the weight of her breath, the silent plea of her hands. I felt raw and opened, not in pain, but in a state of awareness that couldn't be undone. I moved differently beneath the sheets, more carefully, as if her fingerprints still lingered on my skin, and I didn't want to disturb them. I didn't speak to anyone. I answered when required, but my voice felt distant, like it belonged to a version of me that hadn't yet been touched. She didn't come that night. Or maybe she did, and I slept through it. Either way, her absence sat inside me like an unfinished sentence. I stared at the door long after the hallway quieted, hoping to see her silhouette appear in the frame. The bed felt colder, the air thinner. Every shift of the blankets made me feel untethered. I wrapped my arms around myself under the sheets and tried to recall the exact pattern of her breathing when she leaned over me, but it slipped further away with every hour. The second night was the same, or worse. I watched the nurses come and go, faces I didn't care to remember, voices that skimmed the surface of care but never touched anything deeper. I waited for her, but it wasn't just longing, it was withdrawal. My skin ached in a way I hadn't felt before, not from illness, but from lack. I wanted her hand on my wrist, her thigh near my hip. I wanted to be seen again, in the way only she had managed, without explanation, without mercy. On the third night, the door opened quietly and she stepped inside. She moved as if she had never left, but her energy was different, more restrained, cautious, like a thread pulled too tight. She didn't look at me right away. She focused on the monitors, on the IV line, on the curtain that didn't need adjusting. I watched her from beneath half-lowered lids, my body tense but silent. When she finally did look at me, her expression was unreadable. Not cold, not warm, just unreadable. Her hands were careful as they checked the machines, but they avoided my skin. No lingering fingers, no stolen seconds, just tasks. She moved with intention, but not intimacy. My throat closed. I felt like I was watching her through glass, there, but untouchable. My body remembered her, but she moved as if nothing had passed between us, as if it had been a dream that only I had. She turned to leave, her hand brushing the door handle, and that's when she paused. Her back was to me, but I saw her hesitate. I didn't move. I didn't call her name. I just waited, breath frozen, praying for something, anything. She stood there for a moment, then stepped back inside, closing the door behind her with a soft click that sounded like surrender. The light from the hallway vanished, and we were alone again. This time, she didn't go to the machines. She came to the bed, slowly, deliberately. Her eyes found mine, and the tension in my chest cracked open. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. I shifted beneath the blanket, inviting her without words. She sat down gently, her hand finding my arm, her thumb brushing against my elbow. The touch was light, hesitant, different from before, but I welcomed it. She stayed beside me longer this time, not to perform a task, not to assess, just to be near. I could feel the weight of her gaze, even when she wasn't touching me. Her fingers traced a line along my forearm, following veins as if reading a map. My breath slowed, my body softened. The distance that had grown between us began to shrink again, 1 inch at a time. Her touch was no longer hungry, but reverent. It felt like an apology in the language only skin understands. Eventually, her hand slipped beneath the blanket and found mine. No movement, no intention, just stillness. Her fingers interlaced with mine, and I closed my eyes, allowing the weight of her presence to settle over me. There was no urgency, no seduction, just 2 women in the dark holding on to a moment that had almost disappeared. The walls around me, once solid, once cold, began to feel porous, as if this room, this bed, this silence, none of it was real without her inside it. The line between us wasn't erased, but it became translucent. I could see her through it, feel her through it. She didn't climb into the bed, but she leaned closer, her face hovering near mine, her breath warming my cheek. I felt her lips touch my forehead, slow and soft. It wasn't a kiss of desire. It was something else entirely, a confirmation, a return, a vow not yet spoken. She left before dawn. I heard the door open and close, but this time, the silence she left behind didn't feel empty. It felt full. I lay awake, watching the light shift along the walls as the sky changed, and realized something had opened between us again, not like before, not with fever, but with clarity, with intention. The next day, I moved differently. I felt my body from the inside out, every nerve alert, every muscle attuned. I was no longer waiting. I was remembering, anticipating, holding space for what had changed, not just in her, but in me. I no longer wanted just her touch. I wanted her presence. I wanted the truth of her, whole and unfiltered, whatever it meant, however it hurt. And for the first time since arriving here, the walls didn't feel like walls anymore. They felt like a veil, something thin enough to pass through, something ready to be pulled aside. It happened without warning. One morning, a new nurse I hadn't seen before entered my room with a clipboard and a neutral smile and told me I'd be going home. Just like that. No slow buildup, no preparation, no familiar face to ease the transition. Her voice was cheerful, detached, almost rehearsed, as if she had no idea that the walls of this room had held more than just medical recovery. I nodded, not because I was ready, but because I didn't know how to ask for more time without revealing too much. She helped me gather my things, though there was hardly anything. A book I never finished, a pair of slippers I wore once, a few toiletries that smelled like anonymity. I got dressed in slow, clumsy motions, my body unfamiliar in real clothes again. The gown had become a second skin, a strange kind of uniform that made the moments with her feel enclosed, contained, private. Now, pulling fabric over my shoulders, fastening buttons with unsteady fingers, I felt like I was stepping out of something sacred into something ordinary. It felt wrong. The nurse handed me a folder of instructions, prescriptions, emergency numbers. She spoke in a kind tone, but her words barely landed. They floated around me like dust in sunlight. I stood there, holding the papers, nodding, pretending to absorb the information. But my mind was elsewhere. I kept glancing at the door, waiting, expecting, hoping for her to appear, to say something, anything, to give me one last touch, one last glance, one final confirmation that I hadn't imagined any of it, but she didn't come. I left the room slowly, each step reluctant, dragging invisible threads behind me. The hallway felt colder than before, longer, more echoing. I passed other nurses, other patients, other lives in motion, none of them mine. Everything looked the same, but I was no longer part of it. I was a visitor now, walking backward through a world that had briefly opened its arms to me and then shut them without explanation. The exit doors were glass. Beyond them, sunlight, noise, movement, the reality I'd once known, now distant and strange. I paused before stepping out, looking over my shoulder, just once. The hallway behind me was empty, still. The door to my room already closed. Whatever happened in there was sealed now, tucked away like a file no one would ever open again. I walked out into the day, feeling like I was leaving a part of myself behind, something small and fragile that I didn't know how to carry with me. The air outside was too bright, too loud. The world moved at a speed I wasn't ready for. Cars passed, people spoke into phones, children screamed across a parking lot. I blinked against the light, the noise, the sensation of being too exposed. My limbs ached from use, my chest felt hollow, and I realized how much of myself I had left behind in that bed. Not just pain, not just illness, but something tender, something that had been growing quietly in the dark, now uprooted before it could bloom. I got into the back seat of a waiting car, someone from the service the hospital had arranged. The driver didn't speak. He didn't need to. I stared out the window, watching the buildings blur past, trying to keep myself together. The city looked the same, but I wasn't the same woman who had collapsed in a store aisle days or weeks ago. I had changed in ways I couldn't explain to anyone. Not to the driver, not to friends, maybe not even to myself. At home, the silence was different, not heavy like the hospitals, but aimless. I set down the folder on the kitchen counter and stood still for a long time. The furniture, the smell of fabric softener, the ticking of the hallway clock, all of it felt out of place, as if I had broken into someone else's life. My bed felt too wide, my clothes too stiff. I walked room to room, touching things I used to call mine, trying to remember who I had been before. I couldn't find her. In the bathroom, I caught my reflection and froze. I stared at the woman in the mirror, her eyes older, darker, as if she'd seen too much and couldn't say any of it out loud. My hand lifted on instinct, brushing the edge of my neck where her lips had once touched. The memory of it made my knees weaken. I looked into my own eyes, searching for proof that it happened, that it wasn't a fever dream or a hallucination brought on by medication and loneliness. I reached for my phone, though I didn't know why. I had nothing, no number, no full name. I tried searching the hospital website, scrolling through faces, titles, staff photos. None of them were hers. I clicked on one, then another, each time a sinking disappointment. It was like trying to catch smoke. She wasn't listed, no trace, no footprint, as if she had only existed inside the room, part of the bed, a night, the silence. I thought about going back, pretending something was wrong, faking a symptom, an emergency, anything to get through the door again, but I knew how that would look. I knew what that would make me, so I didn't. I closed the tabs, turned off the phone, and sat on the edge of my bed, still wearing the clothes I'd left the hospital in. I stayed there for hours, staring at nothing, letting the ache settle into something more permanent. Later that night, I opened the top drawer of my nightstand and took out a pen and a notepad. I tried to write about her, about what happened, but the words failed me. They all sounded flat, inadequate, like shadows of a feeling too complex to name. I tore the page out, crumpled it, tried again. Still nothing. I folded the notebook shut and placed it back where it belonged. Lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling in the dark, the same way I had in that room. I imagined her next to me, imagined her breath, the shape of her hand on my thigh, the heat of her skin against my back. I imagined what she might have said if she'd come to say goodbye. But the truth was, she hadn't, and maybe that said more than any goodbye ever could. I didn't cry. I just lay there, listening to the silence, trying to figure out if what I felt was grief or something worse, something messier, something that had no name because it wasn't supposed to exist at all. I reached beneath the blanket and touched the inside of my wrist, the place where her fingers had rested so many times. The skin was cool now, bare, and I realized it wasn't just her absence I missed. It was the version of me that had only existed in her hands. Days passed, then weeks. I returned to routines that felt hollow, moving through the hours with the shape of her still pressed into the memory of my body. I thought I would forget how quickly hospitals fade into shadows once the wristband is cut and the bruises from the IV begin to disappear. But forgetting her was impossible, not because she had made some grand gesture or left me with anything to hold. It was the absence that did it, the silence that echoed louder than any goodbye. I started searching for her in ways I didn't want to admit. Late nights at my desk, scrolling hospital staff directories, typing in fragments of a name I never fully caught. I looked through lists of night shift nurses, clicked on profiles, stared at grainy staff photos, hoping something would shift inside me. But nothing matched. Her face never appeared. It was as if she had been scrubbed from the records, or worse, never existed at all. A ghost in scrubs, folded into the walls of that room like part of its architecture. I told myself I was being dramatic. That intimacy in isolation distorts everything. But some part of me still wanted validation, proof, something to anchor the nights we'd shared in flesh and fact. One afternoon, a plain envelope arrived with no return address. Inside was a photograph, printed on matte paper, slightly bent at the edges. I knew it was from her before I even looked at the image. My hands trembled as I turned it over. It was a photo of her, dressed in scrubs, standing next to an elderly woman lying in a hospital bed. The woman's face was relaxed in sleep, and her hand rested loosely over the blanket. My nurse, stood with one hand on the bed rail, the other lightly touching the woman's forearm. Her expression was soft, intimate, focused. The timestamp at the bottom read 3:47 a.m. I stared at it for a long time, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, trying to reconcile the familiar tenderness in her face with the cold certainty blooming in my chest. This wasn't me. This wasn't my room. This wasn't our night. And suddenly, a quiet crack formed in the narrative I had been clinging to. The way she had touched me, the care in her movements, the silence charged with meaning. Had it only felt unique because I needed it to be? How many others had received that same expression, that same touch? Had I simply been one more patient in a line of nameless, grateful bodies aching for connection? Had she read me so well that she knew exactly what to offer to keep me tethered? I felt nausea rise slowly, not from illness, but from the sinking recognition that I might have been a part of something practiced, something repeated. I wanted to believe she had chosen me, that our silence was different. But now the truth became fluid, shifting beneath me like water. What if her care wasn't love, wasn't longing, but a quiet manipulation wrapped in intimacy? What if I had been seduced not by her, but by my own need to be special? Still, the photo didn't feel cruel. It didn't mock me. It simply was a record, a reminder, a window into a reality I hadn't been prepared to see. I turned it over again and again, half hoping for a note, a signature, a message in invisible ink that would tell me I had meant something more. But there was nothing. Only the image, only her touch on someone else, a repetition of gestures I had believed belonged to me. I kept the photo, not because I wanted to, but because I couldn't throw it away. It was evidence, not of betrayal, but of perspective. It forced me to look at myself, at how easily I had given meaning to something that had no name, how willingly I had surrendered my boundaries for the promise of being seen. I wasn't angry with her. I wasn't even sad. I was simply exposed, stripped of the illusion that what we had was untouched by routine or repetition. In the weeks that followed, I returned to that moment again and again, not to punish myself, but to understand. I imagined her in other rooms, leaning over other patients, using the same soft voice, the same still gaze, the same careful hands. Maybe she gave each of us what we needed. Maybe that was her gift. Or maybe it was all a performance. I'll never know. And perhaps that's the real cruelty of it. Not the doubt, but the permanence of unknowing. Some nights, I still feel her beside me, not in memory, but in muscle. My body remembers her weight, her breath, the tremble of her mouth against my skin. It's like a reflex now, something that lives beneath the surface and wakes when the house is quiet and the dark returns. I let it come. I don't fight it. It's the only part of her that's truly mine. What we had was real to me, and maybe that's enough, even if it was never true for her.